All right, 522-0750. 522-0750 is the number in Anchorage, 888-90-9750. We have Bob Poe with us. He's running for governor on the Democratic ticket. Offshore drilling, I know you probably, I should probably say right off the bat, your wife works for Shell Oil.
Yeah, my wife works in sustainable development around education and workforce development with Shell.
And so, with that in mind.
Nice arm's length relationship here.
As a candidate for governor, is there really much you can do to move offshore drilling along, or is it all in the hands of the courts and Mr. Obama?
Well, it's a federal relationship, so I'm as hopeful as anybody to see that be successful. I think one of if we can go back to something we were saying at the top of the show about the contribution that oil makes. Now, if offshore happens, it will contribute to that 1/3 of the economy that are jobs.
In a big way.
In a big way. But understand it won't do much at all on the 90% that's the
state revenue. But there's going to be some revenue sharing, isn't there?
Very small amount. I think it's 10%. So one of the things I think the governor and the congressional delegation ought to be arguing for daily is a better revenue sharing, because all the other coastal states got it, and
Louisiana got a big chunk.
Alaska was specifically left out of that deal. So we ought to be brought up to par with the other states.
Yeah, but just the jobs alone.
Jobs are important. Jobs are really important.
I know your opponent, Hollis French, was once saying, I don't care about offshore drilling. It's not going to give put any money in the state coffers. As though the jobs meant nothing. Yeah,
and the thing the thing that we always have to think about is the range of services we have here. In Anchorage, you can get virtually any kind of service that you could get in any other city. In fact, to get the kind of services we have in Anchorage, you'd normally have to go to a community of about 750,000 people.
Yep.
So oil does help that in a lot of those jobs. But remember that a lot of offshore jobs will be out of state workers. There won't be any real necessity to have those be Alaskans, and those are going to be challenges to us. So, but as you pointed out earlier in the conversation, a lot of the alliance companies will be working with Shell, and I mean those are all great things. We want to see offshore. We want to see continued successful industrial development here.
Now, one issue that the state plays a gigantic role in is Pebble Mine.
Yeah.
Where do you come down on that?
Well, I think that I come down on the due process side. I think that every company should have the opportunity to make their case. What was talked about at the very beginning of Pebble sounds pretty scary, and there are a lot of conservatives that feel that way. Fishermen who otherwise have very conservative positions, but boy, they're not in favor of Pebble at all. So the thought of a 900-foot tailings dam above the richest fishery in the world sounds like it could be disastrous if something happened. On the other hand, they have not advanced a plan of mining yet, and we ought to wait to see that. Now, as governor, since I worked at Environmental Conservation as the Admin Services Director, and I dealt with all the politics for DEC under Hickel, I understand the agency pretty well. I know there are a lot of good people there that aren't necessarily against mining. They just want to make sure that the water quality and so forth is protected, and we want them to as well. So if they decide pro-mine, I will defend them. If they decide anti-mine, I will defend them.
Yeah,
we got to let the process work.
With all the concerns environmentally, if it's done right, it could be a pretty big boom for our economy. When you talk about diversifying the economy, boy, you're not going to...
Yeah, I just heard Mayor Allsworth talk last week. He's from the Lake and Penn Borough, and he lives on Lake Clark. I mean, if you talk about a real bush pilot living in the wilderness, this guy's it. And he was saying, saying that you can't do something is like saying there are no good ideas, that you also can't think of any good ideas. But we got to be careful on this one. This fishery has supported incomes for 110 years or so.
Well, let's talk about incomes and jobs out in rural Alaska, because that's a real concern.
Yeah.
There aren't any. Well, there aren't any. There are very few. Very few prospects for any kind of economic development. as governor, what can you do?
Well, there are a few things. Now, first, I think it's important for particularly urban Alaskans to think about what employment used to be in rural Alaska, and it was subsistence. And if you ask any elder who lived a true subsistence lifestyle, they'll say they were busy all the time. It was hard work all the time. So there was full employment in rural Alaska. What happened is the world changed. So it's not like rural Alaskans don't want to work. Just, they can buy food now and so forth. So I think it's going to be small businesses, and the Internet should play a big role in it. So the first thing we can do is, we're not going to get roads to them, so let's get the Internet to them, because that can be
Why can't we build roads?
Well, because of so much we become the target for so many environmental groups around the country and around the world, and it really does become a very difficult thing. So even though we want to, I like roads, my wife and I drive all over the highways here in Alaska, it's not likely to happen. So I'm a guy who deals in which strategy will work. So from my standpoint, getting telecommunications, good broadband to rural Alaska is important first. Second is lowering the cost of energy. That's very important because it's a barrier to any kind of business being out there successfully. The third thing I would do, it's about getting other people to come up with good ideas.
But let me interrupt you before you go into that. How are you going to lower costs for energy, and how are you going to lower the expenses of living in Bush, Alaska?
Well, energy is the number one cost, and it all comes down to the price of a gallon of diesel fuel or heating oil. So what we've got to do is use as much alternative energy as we can to penetrate down into that diesel cost.
But alternative energy is more expensive sometimes.
Not when you're dealing with $9 a barrel or $9 a gallon.
But it's
fuel.
not cheap.
It's not cheap, but neither's the fuel. And Kotzebue is a great example. So Kotzebue has over 20 turbines now. I think it's closer to 30 now, and they get a 40% penetration. That is, that 40% of their electricity over the year is produced by wind.
But how much does that save them? Because I would imagine that
it saves them 40% in terms of the fuel cost.
But the initial investment,
there is an initial investment that has to be amortized over the life of the project. But I think they actually are a strongly net positive.
Okay.
In other parts, and we're going to see this as the state unrolls its energy plan. In other parts, there are other strategies you can use, small hydro and that sort of thing. One of the other things to think about, Dan, if Alaska focuses on that under 5 megawatt world where we really start to perfect this stuff, if we can make it standardized and sort of plug and play, that technology could be sold in Africa, China, South America, all over the world, because there are all sorts of parts of this world, that the stands, where it's disconnected from the grid. And so we could be experts around the world with this idea. And I think that's really worthwhile. But I want to say one more thing about business ideas.